Millionaire abandons his girlfriend. Years later, he sees her with quadruplets and wants to take her kids away, but what she does leaves him utterly shocked. But before we dive into the story, drop a comment below about where you're watching from. Enjoy the journey, everyone. Claire stood in the bridal suite, nervously adjusting her veil. Her best friend, Emily, hovered nearby, trying to comfort her. Emily smiled weakly. The ceremony's supposed to be starting any minute now. Claire. He loves you. He'll be here soon. He just wants everything to be perfect. But Claire knew something was wrong. Richard wasn't the type to be late. The clock on the wall ticked away, and each passing second made her chest tighten. She stole a glance at the door, hoping, praying for Richard to walk in. Finally, the door opened, but it wasn't Richard. It was the priest, his solemn face telling her what her heart already knew. "I'm so sorry, Miss Claire. We've received word that Richard won't be coming," he said, his words like a dagger. Claire's knees buckled, but she gripped the table for support. Her tears started to smear her makeup, her hands trembling as she whispered, This can't be happening. There must be some mistake." Without a word, Claire bolted from the room, running down the aisle, her heart shattering. With each step, eyes followed her, whispers, stares, the sting of humiliation cutting deeper than any physical wound. When she reached the parking lot, Claire stopped, desperate to see Richard's car, but it was empty. She looked to the sky, her heart racing as she fought to keep the tears in check. Why? The question screamed in her mind. What did I do wrong? Her mind flashed back to a conversation 2 weeks earlier. She could still hear his voice, distant, almost absent, as he held her hand. "Are you sure you want this?" Richard had asked. "Of course I do. We love each other, don't we?" Claire had responded, confused by the question. Richard had smiled, but it was a fragile, hollow smile, one she hadn't recognized as a warning until it was too late. Sitting on the curb, her white dress spreading around her, Claire let the tears fall freely. The weight of it all, humiliation, heartbreak, was unbearable. She wanted to disappear. Across the street, hidden in a car, Richard watched her. His fingers gripped his phone, replaying his mother's words in his mind. "This marriage isn't what you need, Richard. Think about your future. This marriage will never work out." Richard lowered his eyes, the guilt gnawing at him. He knew what he had done was unforgivable, but the fear of facing Claire and the weight of his family's expectations kept him paralyzed in his car. As Claire wiped her tears, she made a decision. She wouldn't stay here as a victim. She would leave. The next day, without a single goodbye, Claire left the city. No explanations. No confrontations. She just boarded a bus, heading to an unknown destination, away from the memories of her failed future with Richard. Each mile on that bus felt like a cruel reminder of her past. But Claire knew she couldn't stay. She had to move forward. Staying wasn't an option. The first few months were the hardest. Claire rented a small room in a town she didn't know, working at a local cafe, doing whatever she could to rebuild. But the pain, the sense of failure, it lingered, gnawing at her every day. Then one day, something unexpected happened. Claire had been feeling different, tired, nauseous, out of sorts. She thought it was just the stress from everything that had happened. But one night, in a quiet moment, she bought a pregnancy test. And when she saw the result, her world stopped. Positive. Her heart raced. Fear and joy collided. She was pregnant. Alone. But then, a surprising sense of purpose flooded through her. This baby, this was her second chance. The days that followed were filled with doctor's appointments, adjusting to the reality of motherhood and preparing for the future. But nothing could have prepared Claire for the moment the doctor said those words. "Congratulations, Claire, it's 4. 4. Claire blinked, not understanding. 4? The doctor smiled kindly, explaining the unexpected twist. Claire's mind was reeling. 4 babies. Could she really do this? The doctor reassured her, mothers always find a way. With her pregnancy news, Claire knew everything had to change. Her tiny room was no longer enough. She worked tirelessly at the cafe, saving every penny to rent a modest house on the outskirts of town. And despite the physical and emotional exhaustion, Claire pushed on. With each day, her resolve grew stronger. She balanced medical appointments, work, and preparing for the babies.
There were days when she cried alone in the silence of her new home, wondering if Richard would ever care. But she shoved those thoughts aside. The question no longer mattered. Her children, her 4 little ones, would be her focus. Months flew by. The house was filled with laughter, chaos, and the growing evidence of her strength. And finally, the day arrived. The delivery was difficult, but 4 healthy babies were born. Claire held each of them in her arms, and for the first time in a long while, she felt complete. 5 years passed. The once quiet home was now filled with the sounds of 4 rambunctious little boys: Lucas, the curious one; Noah, shy but affectionate; Liam, the jokester; and Oliver, the little leader. The routine was exhausting. The days are long. But Claire was fulfilled. She worked tirelessly to provide for her family, balancing it all. And somewhere far away, Richard was watching from a distance. He had no idea the strength Claire had found, no idea what she had built, and deep down he regretted everything he had let go. Jobs, no matter how hard they got, she never complained. Each smile from her boys reminded her of why she kept going. But life, as always, has a way of surprising us. One ordinary afternoon, as Claire took her boys to the park to play, she saw someone she never expected, someone who would change everything. She froze, her heart racing. Richard. Claire stood still, her breath caught in her chest as her eyes locked with Richard's. He was sitting on a bench, talking to someone, but the moment their gazes met, everything around her seemed to blur. His expression changed in an instant, confusion, shock, and disbelief flooding his face. But it wasn't just Claire that he was focused on. He glanced at the 4 boys laughing and playing nearby, their faces bright with innocence, unaware of the storm that had just begun to swirl around them. The resemblance was undeniable. Claire's heart hammered in her chest. She couldn't breathe. This was it, the reunion she had feared. The moment she couldn't avoid forever had finally arrived. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. Richard's eyes were still on her, but slowly, as if in a trance, he shifted his gaze to the boys. Claire's mind raced, but her body stayed frozen. The boys were oblivious, racing each other to the slide, the laughter echoing in her ears. This isn't happening. It can't be happening. Claire grabbed her bag, her hands trembling, trying to mask the nervousness bubbling up inside her. She called out to the boys, her voice a little louder than usual. Lucas, Noah, Liam, Oliver, let's go, it's time to head home. The firmness in her tone was enough to make them start gathering their toys, though they protested, asking for more time. But Claire couldn't stay. She needed to leave before Richard could approach her. Just as she turned to go, she heard a voice, a firm voice that made her stomach churn. Claire. Her heart dropped. The voice, his voice. Slowly, she turned to face him. Richard stood a few feet away, his face filled with confusion, mixed with something deeper: surprise, disbelief, and maybe even regret. Richard, Claire murmured, her voice barely a whisper. She tried to sound indifferent, but it was impossible to hide the turmoil within. He stared at her for a long moment. Then his gaze flicked to the boys, who were still busy with their toys. Without a moment's hesitation, he asked, "Are they your kids?" Claire hesitated, her face heating with the weight of the question. She knew there was no avoiding this moment. Her voice trembled as she replied, "Yes, they're my children." Richard stepped closer, his eyes darting between her and the boys, as if trying to piece the puzzle together. "How old are they?" he asked, though the answer was glaringly obvious. Claire took a deep breath, biting her lip, trying to stay calm. "5," she said. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. His eyes widened, and for a moment he couldn't seem to process what he had just learned. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words caught in his throat. Are they mine? The question left his lips as a whisper. Claire felt her world tilt, the ground beneath her feet shifting. She had prepared for this moment for years, but now that it was happening, the words felt like a punch to her gut. She closed her eyes for a moment, then, summoning every ounce of strength she had, she looked him square in the eye and said, "Yes, Richard, they're yours." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Richard ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture Claire remembered all too well. He looked at the boys, who were now glancing back at him, sensing something was different. Something was happening. "Why didn't you tell me?" Richard asked, his voice thick with a mixture of anger and hurt. "Why didn't you reach out?" Claire crossed her arms, her face hardening as the memories rushed back. "You left me, Richard. You walked away without an explanation. I was alone, humiliated, and pregnant. What did you expect me to do?" Richard's face softened, but the guilt in his eyes was undeniable. He opened his mouth, searching for the right words, but they never came. "I need to meet them," Richard said, breaking the silence. Claire instinctively stepped back, her protective instinct flaring up. "It's not that simple, Richard," she said, her voice cold. "They don't know who you are." "Why not?" Richard's voice rose slightly, a mix of frustration and confusion. "I'm their father." The word hit Claire like a tidal wave. Father. The anger and pain surged within her, but she fought to control it. She took a step forward, glaring at him, her voice sharp. "You have no idea what it means to be a father, Richard. You weren't there when I stayed up nights, wondering how to pay the bills. You weren't there when I was up to my ears in diapers, feeding 4 babies at once, alone. Alone. Father, don't make me laugh." Richard stood there, swallowing hard, but he didn't back down. He knew she was right, but part of him couldn't let this go. "I know I made a mistake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But that doesn't change the fact that they're my children too. I have the right to know them." Claire let out a bitter laugh. "You gave up that right the moment you left me at the altar." The word stung, but the moment was interrupted by Lucas, the most curious of the quadruplets, walking up to Claire. "Mommy, who is this man?" he asked, his big brown eyes filled with innocent curiosity. Claire's heart sank as she looked down at her son, unsure of how to respond. But before she could say anything, Richard knelt down to Lucas's level, his face softening. "Hi there, champ. My name is Richard," he said, offering a hesitant smile. Lucas tilted his head, studying Richard for a long moment. "Do you know my mommy?" he asked. Richard chuckled lightly, his eyes glancing at Claire before he replied. "Yes, I do." Claire's heart broke a little as she gently nudged Lucas away, her voice firm. "Go play with your brothers, sweetheart. Mommy will be there soon." Lucas hesitated, sensing something was off, but eventually obeyed. Claire turned back to Richard, her expression hardening. "You can't just show up and expect everything to be fixed. That's not how this works." Richard shook his head, his expression sincere. "I'm not asking to fix everything right now. But I'm not going anywhere, Claire. Not this time. You think you can just show up and talk to them?" Claire's voice was tight with anger, each word laced with years of pain. Richard stood firm, unshaken, yet something flickered in his eyes. "CLA, they're my children. I have the right to know them." His tone was determined, but it lacked the softness that a father's words should carry. Claire let out a bitter laugh, the sound hollow with years of frustration. "Right," she almost spat the word. "You gave up that right when you left me at the altar." Her chest tightened, with a familiar ache. "I raised these boys on my own. You don't know what it's like, Richard, to lose sleep, to sacrifice everything, to struggle through every single day. And now you just waltz back and like you have some right to them." Richard took a slow breath, trying to stay calm. His voice softened, but the hurt in it was unmistakable. "I know I made a mistake. I'm not trying to justify it, But it doesn't change the fact that they're my children too. Claire's heart squeezed painfully in her chest. She could feel the overwhelming urge to protect them, but she knew Richard wasn't someone who would back down easily. Her voice dropped, quiet but cutting. "What do you want, Richard?" He took a step closer, his eyes earnest. "I want to know them. I want to be a part of their lives. Is that too much to ask?" His words were laced with genuine intent, his desperation showing through. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. "It is too much." Her voice broke slightly. "They don't even know who you are, and I'm not going to let you disrupt their lives." A heavy silence hung between them. Then, Richard said the words Claire feared most, the ones that would change everything. "If you don't give me this chance, I'll take it to court." The weight of his words hit Claire like a punch to the gut. For a moment, everything stood still. The silence after Richard left her doorstep was deafening. The storm had begun, and she had no choice but to face it head-on. He'd made it clear. He would use every resource at his disposal to be part of their lives. Days later, Richard's lawsuit arrived, joint custody. Claire was frozen in disbelief. How could he? He'd been absent for 5 years, and now he wanted parental rights? The rage surged within her, but she forced herself to breathe through it. She couldn't let this battle swallow her whole. In her kitchen, Claire sat across from Amelia, her trusted friend and attorney, the reality of the situation sinking in. "CLA, we need to be realistic." Amelia's voice was firm but understanding. "He has money, resources, and a legal team that could wipe us out. But you have something he doesn't. History. You've dedicated yourself to these boys every single day. That counts for more than any courtroom argument." Claire clutched her coffee cup, her hands trembling. But what if that's not enough? What if he has everything and I'm left with nothing? Amelia leaned forward, her expression unwavering. "We'll fight with everything we've got. The first step is your defense. We'll gather evidence, testimonies, whatever it takes to show that you're the one who's been there for them." Claire nodded, though the weight of the upcoming battle pressed heavily on her chest. She had no choice but to protect her children. The courtroom was cold and sterile when the hearing began. Claire could barely keep her composure as Richard and his lawyer spoke of the better life he could provide. His words were smooth, polished, rehearsed. Every sentence about quality education, financial stability, a secure home made Claire's blood boil. How could he claim to offer these things when he wasn't even there? When Amelia spoke, her voice was strong and steady, a stark contrast to Richard's hollow promises. "Your Honor," she began, glancing at Richard's side, "my client, Miss Claire, has dedicated her entire life to raising her children. She's faced challenges that most couldn't imagine, doing everything on her own. While Mr. Richard has wealth, Miss Claire has something more important, a bond built on love, sacrifice, and dedication. That's what these boys need." The judge listened intently, and after the hearing, it was clear the court would require further investigation before making any decisions. As Claire left the courtroom, her chest tight with anxiety, Richard approached her, his voice softer than before. "I don't want to take them from you, Claire. I just want to be a part of their lives." Claire's anger flared. "You say that now, but taking me to court was your idea. That's not someone who wants peace." She could barely control her words. Behind him, Stella, his fiancée, stepped forward, her presence sharp and cold, her smile a thin mask of politeness. "We're just making sure the boys get what they deserve," she said with a saccharine smile that made Claire's blood run cold. Claire didn't hesitate. "What they deserve is stability. What they deserve is love. Something I've always given them. Don't you dare tell me what they deserve." Without waiting for a response, Claire turned, storming away. The echo of her heels on the marble floor felt deafening, but it was nothing compared to the fear gnawing at her. This fight was far from over. The courtroom was heavy with tension. The judge's decision had been made, but Claire felt a flicker of victory. It wasn't much, but the truth about Stella was finally starting to unravel. However, the pressure was relentless. Richard still insisted on being part of the boys' lives, while Stella worked tirelessly to undermine everything Claire had fought for. The battle was far from over, and Claire knew she would need every ounce of her strength to protect her children. The day of the trial arrived. Claire hadn't slept a wink the night before. Anxiety twisted in her, gut as she thought about the boys, their future, and the unknowns that lay ahead. She felt their eyes with her every step as she walked into the packed courtroom, and the weight of their gaze nearly suffocated her. But she refused to break. She couldn't afford to show weakness now. Across the room, Richard sat with Stella and his lawyer, his posture calm, yet Claire could see the flicker of nervousness in his eyes. Stella, on the other hand, radiated an unsettling confidence. Every movement, every glance, seemed to say that she had already won. The judge began the hearing, reviewing the report submitted by the social worker. Claire listened intently as Amelia began presenting her defense, detailing the years of dedication Claire had given as a single mother. It was a narrative of sacrifice, resilience, and love, an unshakable bond. Claire knew it was the truth, her truth. But when Richard's lawyer took the floor, the room seemed to grow colder. Richard's lawyer painted a picture of stability, wealth, opportunity, a better life for the boys. He argued that Richard could provide everything Claire couldn't, emphasizing his financial means and the lifestyle he could offer. Claire felt her chest tighten as his words sank in. His argument was powerful, but she knew deep down that love and emotional connection weren't something money could buy. Not now, not ever. Then came the moment that turned everything upside down. Richard was called to testify. Amelia stepped forward, her presence commanding. She asked the question that had been burning inside Claire for years. "Mr. Richard, could you tell us why you chose to walk away from Claire 5 years ago?" The courtroom held its breath as Richard hesitated, the silence stretching until it became unbearable. Finally, he spoke, his words careful, measured. My mother, convinced me it wasn't the right time. She said the marriage would be a mistake, that I needed to focus on my career." A murmur rippled through the room. Claire's face flushed with anger. The truth, so raw and painful, was out in the open. He hadn't made the decision alone. He'd let his mother control his life. Amelia didn't waste a beat, her voice cutting through the tension. "So, you left Claire at the altar because your mother influenced you?" Richard's discomfort was palpable as he shifted in his seat, but he answered, his voice quieter. "Yes, but the final decision was mine." Amelia pressed on, the next question like a jolt of electricity. "And what role did Stella play in that decision?" For the first time, Richard seemed caught off guard. He glanced at Stella, whose expression remained neutral, though Claire noticed a flicker of unease. Richard cleared his throat. Stella had nothing to do with it. But the tension in the air didn't dissipate. Claire could feel it. There was something more to this story. The mention of Stella seemed to hang over the room like a shadow that no one wanted to address. When Claire took the stand, everything shifted. The courtroom grew still as she spoke of the sacrifices she'd made. "I've done everything I could to give my children a happy and safe life." Claire's voice was steady, but the weight of her words hit hard. "I may not have much, but I've always given them my all. These boys are my reason for living, the reason I keep going every single day." The emotion in her voice caused a few people in the room to wipe their eyes. Even Richard seemed taken aback, though Stella didn't flinch. She remained cold, a look of impatience playing on her lips as she whispered something to Richard's lawyer. Seeing the mounting tension, the judge called for a recess, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental was about to happen. When the session resumed, the door swung open to reveal a figure Claire hadn't seen in years. Morgan, Richard's former housekeeper. Supported by a cane, Morgan entered slowly, but her eyes burned with purpose. Claire's heart skipped a beat as she saw Richard's stiffening posture. He was visibly rattled. Stella, however, averted her gaze, her expression unreadable. Morgan took the stand, her voice calm but her words heavy with truth. "I worked for Richard's family for over 20 years," she began, "and I saw everything that led up to the wedding. Richard's mother, she manipulated the entire situation. She convinced him that Claire wasn't good enough. She told him that the marriage would ruin his career and that Claire didn't have the right social standing." The room erupted in whispers. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, hearing the confirmation of what she had long suspected, of how Richard's mother had played a central role in his abandonment, was like a punch to the gut. But Morgan wasn't done. She paused, her next words shocking the room into silence. Stella was involved too. She was very close to Richard's mother. She supported the idea of him staying away from Claire. She encouraged him to walk away. The silence in the courtroom shattered as gasps filled the air. Richard's eyes went wide, disbelief written across his face. He turned slowly to Stella, his voice barely a whisper. "You knew about all of this?" Stella stood up quickly, her face turning crimson. "That's not true," she snapped, but her words faltered, her nervousness showing despite her best efforts to remain composed. The judge slammed his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. Richard's world seemed to unravel as he processed what Morgan had revealed. Claire could see the cracks forming in his once unshakable facade. As the witness was dismissed, Claire left the courtroom, Morgan by her side, her mind reeling from the revelations. For the first time in years, it felt like the weight of her pain was being recognized. But as relieved as she felt, the fight was far from over. Across the hall, Richard stood frozen, the news of Stella's betrayal weighing heavily on him. His eyes were lost, unable to process the truth of what he had just heard. Stella tried to pull him away, but he brushed her off, clearly shaken. The tension between them was palpable. As Claire walked away, her heart pounding, even as she heard Stella's muffled arguments with Richard, Claire knew this wasn't over. Yet, Claire couldn't deny it. The boy's laughter was genuine, unguarded, a sound she hadn't realized she missed so much. One afternoon, Richard brought a kite to the park, eager to teach the boys how to fly it. Claire couldn't help but watch closely as the wind was perfect, and the boys sprinted across the open field, struggling to keep the kite airborne. Richard cheered them on, his voice full of warmth and encouragement. Liam, always the most competitive, managed to keep the kite flying the longest and shouted with glee. Richard, filled with pride, pulled him into an enthusiastic hug. For a moment, Claire stood frozen, witnessing something she never thought she would, a glimpse of Richard's joy, a kind of happiness she hadn't seen in years. As the weeks passed, Richard's efforts weren't just temporary fixes. He began taking an active interest in the boys' daily lives, asking about their classes, their friends, and even their smallest struggles. He took Noah to an art class, his voice full of admiration as he watched his son's talent blossom. He encouraged Oliver as he struggled with tricky new words, celebrating every milestone like it was his own. And when Lucas made progress in a math game, Richard was the first to clap, his eyes shining with pride. These moments weren't grand gestures, but to Claire, they were everything. They showed that Richard wasn't just going through the motions, he was present. But Claire remained cautious. Despite all his efforts, the past was a shadow she couldn't ignore. She knew better than to believe in a smooth path, without bumps. Still, it was impossible not to notice the transformation taking place. One evening, after the dinner plates had been cleared, Claire was tidying up the kitchen when Richard stepped up beside her, silently helping her with the cleanup. It was a rare, quiet moment between them. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Thank you for letting me be part of their lives, Claire. I know it's more than I deserve." Claire paused, holding a plate in her hand, a million thoughts racing through her. She wanted to respond with sarcasm, remind him of everything he had to make up for. But when she turned and looked at him, she saw something different in his eyes. Sincerity. He wasn't the arrogant, confident Richard she once knew. This was a man vulnerable and determined to make things right, even if it was too late. They're happy. That's what matters, she replied softly, her gaze returning to the sink. But, deep down, she realized something. She was happy too. She didn't just see the joy in the boys. She felt it in herself too, seeing her children smile, seeing them enjoy their time with their father. As time went on, Richard's presence became a natural part of the boys' lives. Lucas was the first to spontaneously call him Daddy during a game, and Richard froze, his eyes widening in surprise. He didn't make a big deal of it, though. He simply smiled, his heart clearly moved, and kept playing with them. Soon, the others followed Lucas's lead, and Claire realized with a mixture of awe and uncertainty that something real was beginning to happen. Despite this growing bond, Claire didn't lose herself. She maintained her independence, continuing to care for the boys on her own and ensuring that her role as their mother was never compromised. To her surprise, Richard respected this boundary. He helped when needed, but never overstepped. One evening, when the house was quiet and the kids were in bed, Richard surprised her by bringing out an old photo album. He handed it to Claire, explaining it was a collection of memories from his childhood that he wanted to share with the boys. As she flipped through the album, Richard narrated each story behind the pictures, small moments of his life that Claire had never known. The boys listened intently, their eyes wide with curiosity. It was a simple moment, but to Claire, it was profound. Richard wasn't just trying with the boys. He was trying with her too, and it made her realize that maybe, just maybe there, was room for something new to grow between them. But as Richard was slowly becoming a fixture in their lives, Stella refused to accept the change. After the court revelations, she had lost much of her control over Richard, and that loss gnawed at her. It wasn't just the rejection, it was the public humiliation of watching Richard build a relationship with Claire and the boys while she was left on the sidelines. Furious and desperate, Stella began plotting. For weeks, she pulled strings behind the scenes, gathering information, weaving plans in the shadows to disrupt the fragile peace that was beginning to form. In her mind, Claire was to blame for everything, and the boys were nothing but obstacles standing in her way. Stella was determined to eliminate them to win Richard back, no matter what it took. The tension between the new family dynamic and Stella's scheming escalated quickly. One day, Claire received a call from an unknown number. A cold voice on the other end sent a chill down her spine. "You think this peace will last? Just wait and see what's coming." Claire's heart pounded, but she refused to give in to fear. She recognized the voice instantly. It was Stella, playing her game. But this time, Claire wasn't about to back down. Without saying a word, she hung up the phone, returned to the living room where Richard and the boys were playing, and tried to act like nothing had happened. But inside, a fire was ignited. She wasn't going to let Stella tear her family apart again. Meanwhile, Stella kept scheming, determined to disrupt everything Richard, Claire, and the boys had built. To her, the court's decision was only temporary, and she was prepared to do whatever it took to destroy it. As Richard continued to show up for the boys, spending more time with them, Claire began to notice subtle changes. He wasn't just playing games with them. He was paying attention to their needs, nurturing their small victories. He helped Lucas build a robot for a school project. He taught Liam how to kick a ball with precision. He encouraged Oliver to face his fear of heights at the playground. And Noah's artwork? Richard carefully stored every drawing in a folder he kept with him, praising each piece like it was a masterpiece. One afternoon, as the boys played outside, Richard offered to help Claire with dinner. She hesitated but eventually relented. As he clumsily chopped vegetables, Claire couldn't help but tease him, a small smirk forming on her lips. "I never pictured you in the kitchen," she remarked. Richard laughed, holding up an unevenly chopped carrot. "Honestly, I've never had to do this before, but I think it's time I learned. Don't you?" Claire watched him for a moment, the soft light from the window casting shadows on his face. There was something different about him, something that was slowly chipping away at the wall she had built. Despite her best efforts to remain guarded, She couldn't ignore the way his patience and dedication to the boys was starting to change her perspective. That evening, Richard surprised everyone by pulling out a guitar. The boys gathered around him as he strummed simple, heartfelt notes. His voice cracked as he sang a children's song, and the boys burst into laughter, especially when he messed up the lyrics halfway through. Standing in the kitchen doorway, Claire caught herself smiling despite herself. It had been so long since she'd seen her children so relaxed, so happy. In the weeks that followed, the bond between Richard and the boys deepened in ways Claire hadn't anticipated. Liam, who had always been reserved, began asking when his father would return. Noah, the artistic one, showed Richard his latest drawings, with a gleam in his eyes. Oliver and Lucas were no different, eager for the next adventure with their dad. Claire didn't know what the future would hold, but in that moment, watching Richard with her boys, she couldn't help but feel a sense of hope that had been absent for so long. To Richard, while Lucas eagerly invited him to play video games almost every day, and Oliver, shy but endearing, followed Richard everywhere, mimicking his every move as if desperate to be just like him. The change was undeniable. Richard had made his way into their lives, and with every passing day, it felt like the cracks of the past were slowly healing. But Claire? She continued to wrestle with her own fears. Part of her was elated to see the boys bonding with their father, creating memories she hadn't thought possible. Yet there was a part of her, buried deep, still terrified that this happiness could be fleeting. Could Richard truly change? Was this transformation permanent? Could she ever let him get close again? One bright morning, as they sat on a bench in the park, Richard turned to Claire, his expression somber. The boys were a blur of energy, running around, tossing a frisbee. Richard's voice broke the gentle sounds of the day, low and sincere. "Thank you for letting me be here, Claire. I know it wasn't easy to give me another chance." Claire didn't meet his gaze. Her eyes stayed fixed on the boys, their laughter filling the air. She could feel the weight of his words, but she didn't know how to respond. "It's not about trust, Richard," she finally said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside. "It's about them. They need stability, and I can't risk you disappearing again." Richard's gaze softened, understanding settling into his expression. He nodded, the sincerity in his words clear. "I get it, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." As much as she wanted to doubt him, a small part of Claire started to believe him. For once, he seemed genuine. He had kept every promise he'd made since coming back. Maybe, he was really committed to being a father this time. That evening, as the boys drifted off to sleep, Richard remained in their room. Sitting on the floor, he held an old photo album in his hands, his voice filled with nostalgia. "When I was a kid, I loved building things," he began, flipping through the album. "Once, my dad gave me a toy toolbox, and I spent weeks trying to build a little house in the backyard. Of course, it collapsed the moment it rained, but it was the most fun I'd ever had." The boys laughed, and Lucas, his voice filled with excitement, asked, "Can we build something, Dad?" Richard smiled, his eyes lighting up. "Of course. We'll start next weekend." From the doorway, Claire watched, her heart swelling. Oliver's eyes were wide with curiosity. As Richard showed him a picture of himself with a building toy, the questions flowed from Oliver's mouth, and Richard patiently explained every detail, his tone gentle, thoughtful. Claire couldn't help but feel a shift inside her. Maybe she had been wrong to keep her guard so high. Maybe it was time to reconsider what she had always thought impossible, forgiving him. The next morning, Richard arrived with tools and materials, eager to build a small wooden playhouse for the boys. The backyard was soon filled with laughter, the clumsy sound of hammering echoing in the air. From the porch, Claire couldn't stop herself from smiling. This wasn't just a project. It was a symbol of the trust, the transformation that was quietly taking root between them. But even as Richard's presence became a comforting constant, Claire couldn't ignore the threat that lingered. Stella, still furious about the growing bond between Richard, Claire, and the boys, was plotting her next move. To her, this new dynamic was a direct threat to everything she had built with Richard, and this time, she was determined not to lose. The days went by, and Richard's efforts became more apparent. Playhouse was taking shape. Richard broke the silence, his voice low. You know I never imagined I'd be here. With you. With them. Claire turned to him, her arms crossed, curiosity in her eyes. What do you mean? For years, Richard continued, I was so focused on work, on other people's expectations, that I didn't see what really mattered. And now, as I'm trying to make things right, I keep asking myself why it took me so long. Claire studied him for a long moment before responding. Sometimes we only realize what matters when we've almost lost everything. Richard's gaze faltered for a moment, but he nodded. There was a vulnerability in his eyes she had never seen before. Their quiet exchange was interrupted by the sound of footsteps from inside. The boys, freshly awake, appeared at the door, rubbing their eyes. Richard smiled, his face lighting up. Yet there was something more in Richard's expression now. He hesitated, as if weighing the gravity of his next words. Finally, he met her gaze, his voice low and serious. Claire, there's something I need to tell you about what happened at the altar. Claire's body tensed at the mention of that day, the day that had torn them apart. For years, she had carried the weight of that moment. Some wounds had begun to heal, but others still stung like fresh scars. She nodded, signaling for him to continue, her heart pounding in her chest. Richard swallowed, taking a deep breath before he spoke again, his voice tight with regret. My mother didn't just convince me to call off the wedding, Claire. She threatened to cut me off completely. She said if I married you, I'd be on my own. No support, no money, nothing. Claire blinked, the surprise in her eyes almost visible. So you left me because you were afraid of losing her money. Richard's face tightened with frustration. It wasn't just about the money, Claire. His voice cracked with a raw honesty she hadn't expected. It was everything. She controlled every part of my life. I was weak. I was scared, and I didn't know how to stand up to her. I ran because I didn't want to face it. I'm not proud of it, but that's the truth. A storm of emotions raged within Claire. Anger, disbelief, pain. But amidst the fury, there was something else, understanding. The pieces were finally falling into place. She took a slow breath, feeling the heaviness in her chest. You should have told me back then, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. We could have faced it together. I would have stood by you. Richard's eyes softened with regret, the weight of her words sinking in. I know, he murmured. I was young, stupid, and afraid. I made the wrong choice, and I've been paying for it every day since. The silence between them grew thick, but this time, it wasn't the silence of distance, it was the silence of a truth shared, a step toward healing. Claire's heart cracked open a little more. Not enough to erase the years of pain, but enough to feel something shift inside her. She looked at him, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you, Richard, but at least now I know what really happened. He nodded, accepting her words, his expression humble. That's all I can ask for. The next morning, as the boys ran to greet their father, hugging him with the eagerness only children could show, Claire stood at a distance, her heart full of conflicting emotions. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this family was starting to come together. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time, it didn't feel impossible. The courtroom was packed again that afternoon. CLA arrived early, gripping Amelia's hand tightly. Her attorney and friend, Amelia, was the only source of comfort in a sea of uncertainty. Claire took deep breaths, trying to stay calm. The tension in her chest had eased since learning the truth about Richard's abandonment at the altar, but forgiveness was still a distant horizon. Richard walked into the courtroom, flanked by his lawyer. There was something different about him today. He seemed more serious, more focused. The man who had once been so distant now, seemed determined to make amends. But Claire noticed that Stella was conspicuously absent. Claire's mind raced. After everything that had happened, it was clear that Stella had stepped back, perhaps to avoid further humiliation. The judge entered, and the hearing began. Both sides presented their closing arguments. Amelia, ever sharp, emphasized the emotional bond Claire had built with the boys, how she had been the constant in their lives. Richard's lawyer argued that he was now committed to being a present father, and that his involvement was essential for the children's well-being. When Richard was called to testify, Claire watched him carefully. He spoke calmly, his words measured. "I know I made mistakes," he admitted, "but I'm here because I want to be the father my children deserve. I won't give up on them, no matter what." His words hit Claire harder than she expected. There was sincerity in his voice, a humility she hadn't seen in him before. But despite it all, the walls inside her remained high, unwilling to crumble just yet. When it was Claire's turn, she stood tall, adjusting her dress with trembling hands. Her voice was steady, but the emotion was there, just beneath the surface. For 5 years, a long way to go, but at that moment, it seemed like he was finally home. Richard stood there, a hesitant smile tugging at his lips. "I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know. And if, one day, you're ready to think about something beyond what happened, I'll be here." Claire stayed silent, her heart a whirlwind of emotions. Richard didn't press. He simply stood, his shoulders heavy with unspoken words. "Good night," he said softly before turning to leave. As he walked away, Claire felt an unexpected flood of mixed emotions. Part of her was relieved, finally. The truth had been laid bare. But another part of her felt lost, still processing all that had been said. She glanced toward the boys, playing in their room, their laughter a soothing reminder of her real priorities. For now, they were everything. Richard was trying to make amends, and maybe, in the future, she'd be ready to consider the possibility he had hinted at. But today, she had to focus on what mattered most, her children. Months passed, and CLA and Richard's lives gradually found a new rhythm. He was increasingly present, not just in the boys' lives, but in hers as well. At first, their relationship had been about the children, but soon, casual lunches, late-night talks, and shared moments with the kids began to feel natural, something neither of them had anticipated, but both secretly longed for. One sunny afternoon, as the boys raced around the playground, Richard walked up to Claire, his usual confidence replaced with an unusual nervousness. "CLA," he began, his voice uncertain. "I've been thinking about us, about everything." She turned to face him, waiting for him to continue, her brow slightly furrowed. "What about this, Richard?" He hesitated for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Maybe we should try again. Not because of the boys, but because I want to. I want to show you that I can be the man you deserve." Claire fell quiet, her eyes drifting to the boys playing in the distance. It was clear to her. Now Richard had changed. He was no longer the man who had walked away all those years ago, but someone who had grown, someone who was learning to put others before himself. Still, the road ahead would not be easy. "It won't be easy," she said, her voice soft but firm. "There's a lot we need to work through." Richard nodded, a small, hopeful smile tugging at his lips. "I know, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." The following months were a fresh start for both of them. Slowly, Richard and Claire began rediscovering each other, now with a deeper understanding of themselves and what they needed. Small gestures became everything. A dinner Richard cooked after a long day, a message of encouragement Claire sent when work became overwhelming, or the simple joy of sharing a laugh as they watched the kids play in the yard. Then one day, Richard took Claire and the boys on a picnic in a field of wildflowers just outside the city. The sky was a perfect blue, the air warm and soft, and the boys ran through the flowers, their laughter blending with the breeze. After a while, Richard motioned for Claire to join him for a walk. He was holding something in his hands, but he kept it hidden. When they reached a secluded spot, with a panoramic view of the meadow, Richard stopped. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers, his voice full of sincerity. "Claire, you're the one who showed me what true love really is. Not the reason I want to be a better man, a better father. I want this second chance to last forever. Will you marry me?" He opened a small box, revealing a simple, elegant ring that seemed to shimmer with the weight of his words. Claire's heart swelled, her breath caught in her throat. She had imagined this moment in all its possible forms, but now, standing in front of him, it was real. The years of pain, the heartache, all of it seemed to dissolve into this single, beautiful moment. "Yes, Richard. Yes, I will." The boys, watching from a distance, saw the moment unfolding and rushed toward them, their voices full of joy. Lucas was the first to ask, his eyes wide with excitement. "Mommy, are you getting married? Are we going to be a real family?" Claire knelt down, wrapping her arms around them with a laugh. "Yes, my loves. We're going to be a family." In the months that followed, wedding preparations were filled with joyful chaos, especially with the boys excitedly insisting on helping. Lucas proudly carried the rings, Noah decorated the venue with flowers, Liam gave a heartfelt speech, and Oliver, full of pride, walked Claire down the aisle. When she and Richard exchanged their vows, it felt as if the weight of the past had been lifted, replaced by a bright future they would build together. After the ceremony, the family celebrated. The kids ran wild in the garden, and Claire and Richard danced under strings of soft lights. He held her close, whispering in her ear, "Promise you, Claire, I'll make you and the boys happy every single day of my life." Claire smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "We're together now, Richard, and that's all that matters." Later that night, the boys surprised them with a special gift, a handmade album filled with their drawings depicting happy moments as a family. On the last page, in big, clumsy letters, they had written, "Our family is forever." As Claire held the album close to her chest, tears welled up in her eyes. For the first time in years, she could see it. The journey that had started with so much pain had led them to this beautiful, imperfect, wonderful place. A family built on love, patience, and the willingness to start over. Do you think Claire made the right decision by forgiving Richard? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What's your score? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to catch all our stories. For more emotional tales, click here on the end screen.